just finished the angle snapping and everything else. And before I delete that, I will just run it, because actually I'm going to think about what I'm going to do next. Now, first off, I'll have to run it again, because I want it running full speed. At the moment, it can draw with 3 different draw modes, although I only generally use one of them. It can draw solid lines, it can draw lines with an alpha value, using just... Drawing lines with the alpha value basically means drawing them normally. It's just you set the alpha value in the color. Actually, well, anyway, come to think of it, I need to test that a bit more. And also drawing them additionally, and that's the one I use basically all the time because it looks nicest. And when you draw them additionally, you get the most information sort of about what happens when the line crosses itself. At any moment, hopefully, it will be running and I'll be able to see it do these things. But there's another way I want to render it. In fact, there are a few other ways of drawing it. One is, well, there are other ways of drawing it. This is addition. And obviously the more iterations, the more recursions you do with additive drawing, the brighter the image becomes. Or the brighter the pixel becomes. And overall the image does become brighter. I have grid snapping on. But there's another way I want to be able to draw it. At the moment it doesn't work, although the option is there, and it's gradient. And gradient is related to oops, it will start to drop frames. It's doing 6 recursions, which is the maximum number I allowed just now in the preview. And it's quite a lot. Well, it's not really a lot. 7 or 8 recursions looks good in a render. Like, I'll do an example of a render. I'll try and catch all of it. And that's doing 5 recursions. If I bump that up to 6, actually, just for the sake of looking at it, yeah, it's pretty much, what's that word, saturated. I will do, well, I'll cut it down to 5 just for rendering it, but I can help that by darkening the ink quite a lot. And I'm going to do that. It'll look strange and this almost disappears, but you kind of have to accept the fact that because many more recursions are going to be drawn in the final render. We'll see what it looks like anyway, because I'm just quickly setting this up. And I'll do 8 recursions. And I'll render it static, and I'll just render it to that. Yeah. And that's it. And there's the image. So with additional blending, you know, the color just layers up, and as it crosses, as the line that's continually being drawn crosses itself, it gets brighter. But what I want is something that's a bit like that, but offers you more control over the colors. So I have a plan in my mind to implement this thing, which I'm going to call gradient rendering. Now at the moment, when it is rendering, either static or animation, they work exactly the same way. It's just animation renders a whole bunch of frames, which FFmpeg then puts together into a video. When it's rendering, I create, using the language's own sort of graphics module, I use what is effectively the Mojo canvas. Mojo allows you to create a canvas you can write to, and then I use the monkey's own commands, the graphics drawing commands, to draw to that canvas, using sort of OpenGL line commands, I think. But basically it's using the graphics hardware to draw the final image. And that has pros and cons. It's nice, obviously, because it means I don't have to think about line drawing commands, and also it means that the line is drawn nicely, you know, possibly more nicely than it needs to be. But for gradient rendering, what I'm going to do, at least for now, is something different, I think. It's going to be that... Sorry, I'm just playing this. I will boost it up while I do. It's going to be that I'm not going to draw it to a canvas. Because for gradient rendering, I want to determine... One thing is, if I switch it to gradient rendering, this button changes to gradient. Doesn't work, unfortunately. But the gradient will just work very differently to paper and ink. At the moment, clicking paper or ink will open up this simple color selector. But a gradient will be a set of color values that determine sort of, you might call them control points on a set of 3 curves. You know, each color value has red, well, it has red, green, blue and alpha, but each of those could be determined by sampling a curve. So I'll define a gradient as being, or I have already in fact defined a gradient as being, I didn't mean to save that. I don't know why it took so long to save as well. Anyway, define a gradient as being a list of color definitions, but whenever you add to the list or subtract from the list or redefine a color on the list, it will recalculate a set of curves. You know, I imagine a set of sliders and the curves having to go through the sliders. That's not really how it'll look, but that's the way I imagine it. Wonder how this curve will go, because I have middle, 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 and wonderful. Red, green, blue. So anyway, the point is that these are splines, just defined in my spline class. It's quite simple, and it's based on very old code that I'd read about in some repository of code samples to make a curve like this with multiple control points that it passed right through. And I've heavily edited it over the years, and it will work for this. Anyway, the point is that the spline runs from 0 to 1, and you just sample it. In this case, actually 3 splines, a red spline, green spline and blue spline. So that once the gradient is set up and you've added whatever colors you want in whichever order, then you get a color out of it by just saying gradient, something like gradient.getColor, and pass a value between 0 and 1, and it'll get you this perfectly smooth, or in theory perfectly smooth rainbow. But the way I want to actually draw that, it is related to this additional drawing mode in that I want higher values associated with larger numbers of overlaps for an individual pixel. So the larger number of times an individual pixel is overlapped by the line as the line draws itself, the further towards that end of the gradient I want it to be. But I want some control over that. I want to be able to set the number. I'm drawing it like this because I'm vaguely imagining the sort of GUI unit I'm going to need. But one way or another, I want to set the lowest value, like the number of times the line... What am I really saying? Yeah, the color that it should, like, the value below which all pixels should be this color, if you know what I mean. Like the low threshold for getting onto the to the gradient, which might be 0, so that this is just the background color, but the minute the line starts to draw, it's on the gradient. But you could make it 10 and just make it so the line drawing doesn't really affect the color of the pixel at all until it's crossed itself 10 times. I have wondered about putting in a coarseness value so that it builds a set of thresholds into it that the line has to then cross a further 10 times. I'm not so sure about that. But also, for sure, an upper value, which you could set to be huge, 100,000, or set to be something like -1 if you effectively wanted no upper value. Or you set to be something else, and it represents the number of crosses beyond which it makes no difference, like the getting off point of the gradient. To set an upper limit, yeah, this is the array of things I imagine. There is another thing, though, which is, I have a funny feeling it might end up being beneficial if I could actually decide how the gradient changed over time as well. Because, of course, this can render animations. And maybe you would want the gradient to be like this at the beginning of the animation, but something completely different at the end. And I have thought about this sort of GUI object that I would be using. You know, these you have to imagine being what? You have to imagine them being color buttons, looking very much like this. And when you click on them, a color selector opens. And arranged in what's supposed to be a grid fashion. Not quite a grid, actually. But that this is time, 0 to 1. The animation just has a beginning, an end, and somewhere in between. And this is... Well, what it is overlap, but there's probably a better word for it, with min and a max overlaps. Again, I'm just drawing these as if I'm imagining little fields or buttons that you click on to set them. And in among this, there does have to be other gadgets. Like this is a color button and that is an add button. Oops, I made a mistake. That is not an add button, that's a color button. Add. And in this case, what on earth? Oh yeah, add. I'll draw the add ones around. Ish. And add. And add. So that this is a very kind of... It's a display that allows you to really change the shape, because there's actually another button. When I'm describing these buttons, some of them are solid, and some of them are kind of... I'm drawing this extremely crappily. Doesn't matter. Imagine these things being squarish. These color buttons will appear solid. A solid block of color, you click on it, you get to select the color. These add buttons and these large add buttons will have a frame to show their outline, and the add symbol will be clear on them, maybe with a word as well, but will actually be largely transparent, that you'll just look straight through them, because displayed on the background of this entire gadget should be a gradient showing the gradient as it relates to the increasing number of overlaps in a render, and the gradient as it changes from the beginning to the end of the render. When this gadget would first be opened, to first determine the gradient, it would look like this. And that's about it. It would have the bit at the top with a bit at the bottom. I suppose it would need maybe a button here, and that would be it, more or less. This would be editable, that would be editable, that would be a color button, that would be a color button. There would be OK and cancel. What else would there be? Not a lot else. Maybe a little symbol or a little indicator that this is time, and this is what? Overlaps? Something like that. So, and then, so clicking this would add a column and another, stupid thing to draw, would add a column and another add button between the columns. Clicking this, or any one of the adds, adds another color to the individual gradient. So there might be a practical limit to the number of colors you could have in a gradient, but really it'd be pretty high. You know, I can make the gradient editor fairly big on the screen. And that is kind of how I imagine the gradient editor being. I may make it of a fixed height, and might make it alter its own width as you add and remove columns. Is that what I would do? This I'd probably need, actually when I think about this, I'd need an add button on either side of that, and an add button on either side of this. It's a headache to think about, but actually, yeah, just to make it sort of properly flexible, so you can insert. I mean, to make it properly flexible, you should be able to grab one of these columns, drag it over, and drop it again. Now, that's not impossible with my GUI. Yeah, I mean it's not impossible, but it's not a thing I can be bothered doing, basically. Not just now. If it turns out that all this works really well, then maybe I want to beef up the functionality of it a bit, but I think this will give enough. This is a large amount of faffing with a gadget though, and a gadget which is kind of like one of these things. Oops, is this even running? A gadget which is a bit like one of these, but not quite. This is a volatile gadget. If I click away, it just is as if I'm clicking cancel. The colors are also volatile gadgets. But a problem with a volatile gadget, as I've currently defined it, is that it will abandon itself if any other gadget which is not a child of the gadget gets clicked on. So I can't make the gradient button open up a volatile gadget, because the gradient button itself has to open up these volatile gadgets. I could make them children of the gradient button, but a consequence of being a child of another gadget is that you appear entirely inside it. It's a pretty big gadget to appear entirely inside the gradient gadget. It's not too big, but it's just an awkward thing to do. But the gradient gadget doesn't need to be a volatile gadget. It can just be a non-volatile one, and I can open it the same way, effectively. Probably what's better is that it's a gadget like this. This is not a volatile gadget. This is actually a window. You can tell it's a window because you can resize it. I can open a window like this which basically shuts everything else down until you click a button. And I think that's what it's going to be for the gradient gadget. The other alternative is that I just open a window. Yeah, I mean I could do. The problem... Yeah, I probably will. I could open a gradient editing window and I could make it resizable and you could just see more or less of your gradient, and you could cram it all, and then I give the user the responsibility for how good or bad their window looks. I can give it a minimum size so it can't be crushed up too small. But ultimately, the way all those buttons will be arranged on it, these things, if it's a resizable window, then they'll just squash around. It'll look cool. And then if you want to, you will, well, I guess... Well, what I'm trying to get at is, if you open a gradient window, then it's there on the screen. You play with the buttons, it updates the actual gradient object in real time, does it? I think it does. And then you can, or does it? I mean, I could make it does, but then there's no point putting a cancel button on, or if there is a cancel button, then, I do some faffing around about storing an old version of it when the window opens. Or I make it that it doesn't alter, and you click and apply, and, you have to either click apply or you click cancel, I guess. That would be okay. I think probably maybe actually that would be the best thing. It does bring me on to something else. One of the advantages of making it alter the gadget, the class in real time, the gradient, the instance of the gradient class in real time, is if I could do a background render, you'd see it in real time. But that brings me on to the next thing, which is, I don't know about this preview render for a gradient. I've thought about it and wondered if there might be a sort of way of doing a low resolution render. Because it will be very different. I don't intend to use the graphics sort of draw commands to render it when I'm doing the gradient version. I plan to use an array. So these are some thoughts about it. Let me check my time. After more than 20 minutes, and I'm only really... I think that this is the next thing. It's an annoying big gadget, but it's useful in one way in that I can give it a sort of option, which is, do you want to edit just a gradient, or do you want to edit an array of gradients? Because just being able to edit that gradient editing thing is probably reusable to an extent, So, the gadget will be next and I am pretty much going to leave it at that just now, because that's at least given me a sort of plan. What on earth is... Oh yeah, no, that's me remembering that I need extra ads, because I do have to start planning out just planning out the size of it and shape of all these things. Okay, before I go, I will just say that I'm not planning on using the graphics card. There are a couple of options. I could use an array and just write into the array, using, I think it's called a Brezhnev line, just a simple line drawing routine, which again is something I've sort of known about for a long time. Which will draw this sort of line, a set of bricks. Now, I mean, it's going to be really different to the way it draws it so far, because at the moment, like I say, I think I'm getting the benefit of the nice way that OpenGL will draw its lines. Mine are not going to be like. They're going to be sets of bricks drawn across either an array or a data bank. Monkey language does allow use of probably more appropriate things than arrays for this. The arrays are structs, I think, in Monkey. And I think that a data bank type class would be better. I'll have a little look into it before I sit down to try and code that part of it. But I probably will sit down in a little while and start to code this part, which will actually just generate a window with a gradient over time display. So 26 minutes. How long was that mic off for, I wonder? I'll soon find out. Right, next time I start coding that gradient.